This is the YouTube version of the Hidden Experience audio podcast. This show is hosted by Mike Cleland, and that's me, and it is available on most of the popular podcast platforms. Just search out Hidden Experience Audio. And if you want to support the show, you can find it on Patreon, as well as Buy Me a Coffee. This YouTube version has ads, but the audio version is always ad-free. And you can also join my YouTube channel here. And now the show. Audio conversation with Darren King, recorded Friday, April 12th, 2024. Now, the last time I spoke that simple introduction was 10 long years ago. This was within the previous incarnation of my podcast, Hidden Experience. That platform has been dormant for a full decade, and I'm resurrecting it now. I will talk more about this in some separate recordings, but for now, let me say I'm back, and wow, am I rusty at this. Enough about that for now. Back to this show and my guest. Darren King might be better known as ExoAcademian, and that's his online moniker. His podcast, Point of Convergence, explores an interlocking set of ideas that includes UFOs and the non-human intelligence behind them, as well as a set of related phenomena such as near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, remote viewing, and the nature of reality itself, and how consciousness serves as a sort of bedrock connecting all of it. I first heard Darren on a set of other podcasts where he was the guest, and I immediately recognized that we are on a similar wavelength. In this interview, we talked for a long time, so no need to say much here. We cover a lot of his own story and the work he's doing in the show. And we also reference a few other podcasts where Darren shared some of his personal experiences, and those will be in the show notes. I'm not sure if you can hear the roosters. We have roosters here at the house, and they might invade the audio a little bit here, and there's not much I can do about it. Okay, during the podcast with Darren, during the recording, we had some... those roosters. During the recording with Darren, we had some technical issues, and we got disconnected a few times. And I did my very best to clean that up in the editing process. You might notice some points where the conversation jumps a bit, and that was the source of it, just those dropouts. There was actually one point where his electricity went out at his place, and we couldn't connect with each other for about a half hour. This interview comes in at about an hour and a half, and there is an extra 20 minutes or so for Patreon members. And now, my interview with Darren King. Please enjoy. Darren, I want to thank you so much for saying yes to this interview. It means a lot to me.
I'm happy to join you, Mike. Looking forward to our conversation today.
Great. Full disclosure here, I had not heard of you in any meaningful way. I had certainly seen references to your podcast online and such, and my life has been busy over the last few years, and I heard your show that you did with Kelly Chase, and that is posted, I'm pretty sure, on her site, the UFO Rabbit Hole, and then you also did a show on Whitley Strieber's site, Unknown Country, where she is hosting once a month. And I was impressed is the wrong way to say it. I had wrestled with many of the ideas that you were talking about, and you were speaking about them so clearly and so beautifully, and I felt really inspired to reach out and have this conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I've had a couple conversations with Kelly, like you said, one time on her podcast and once on Dreamland. And absolutely, I think those of us who really deeply dive into this and have had personal experiences, we begin to go in some strange directions and then try to knit it all back together. So happy to explore some of those veins today with you.
Great. So what was the genesis of your podcast? Let's just start there. I mean, you are just alone in a room with a microphone. And what's the process you go through for your shows?
Well, basically what happens is I I want to say clearly that I feel very led in what I end up discussing on the podcast, and each podcast episode feels a little bit like some breadcrumbs have been dropped for me, and I tend to follow those. I sometimes have people ask me, which 20, 30 books should I read to sort of gain the perspective you have? And I think it doesn't quite work that way, because I feel like there's this overarching synchronistic orchestration that tends to happen, and I feel like I get led to a certain book I'm supposed to read, a person I'm supposed to connect with, a podcast I'm supposed to tune into, and it feels very much tied to what I need to pick up next in my journey, and it wouldn't necessarily be that way for someone else. So basically, when I first began the podcast, I knew that I wanted to discuss the intersection between not just the UFO phenomenon, but phenomena like near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, psi phenomena, that kind of thing. And that's why I called it Point of Convergence. And I kind of dove in head first, wasn't sure exactly where I would go and when. But over time, after those initial episodes, kind of tried to touch on each of the main players in terms of hypotheses and that kind of thing, I then began to get a real sense of leading. And that has led me up right till now. So I tend to record an episode, and then there's a 2-week gap. So the off week will be a Liminal Frames episode. So I have 2 weeks in between Point of Convergence episodes. And when it comes time when I finish, for instance, the Liminal Frames cycle, and I'm going now into the week of a POC episode, I will usually get a sense early in that week of what it should be about. And it's pretty much always happens that way. And then I begin to put together research and start making bullet point notes. And then towards the end of the week, I kind of organize those, get clear about them. And then usually by Friday, I've basically have a clear idea bullet point list of what I want to discuss. And then I also write from scratch a sort of 3 to 5 minute intro to that episode that is actually something I read aloud in the very intro part. The rest is all bullet points that I do kind of live. And that ends up being now about a 45-minute episode each time. And that's kind of the process I take. And where I go, I don't really know. So the next one, I have an idea already what it'll be about. But the one after that, I have no idea. But I always end up getting a sense of leading once we actually get there.
You used the term led. I was led to do this. You said breadcrumbs, and you said overarching synchronistic experiences or synchronistic orchestration. I'm not sure exact, but wow, like you just dropped those things right in there. And let me tell you, like this is something I understand with a clarity that like there are very few people I can talk with about that sense of like my path just unfolding in front of me. Like that is something I understand very clearly.
Yeah, it's I know to some people who maybe are coming into the UFO phenomenon from the nuts and bolts side might wonder what on earth we're talking about at this point. But I think those who've had these kinds of experiences will know full well what we mean. And for me, it's kind of been going back quite a long period of time, a slow encroachment from some kind of overarching intelligence that has now got to the point where I feel very much in lockstep with it. And it feels very normal to me now, even though I know for some people this will sound shocking and discombobulating and they'll have a hard time metabolizing what we're saying. But it basically happened in several steps for me in terms of a ramping up of the kind of communication and how like intimately close it felt to me. But it's now to the point where it's just an understood part of my life that I will get these droplets that come in that sometimes even when they come in, I don't know exactly what they're going to be, but they end up unfolding throughout the week as they need to. So it feels very much even like there's a knowledge there that goes across our usual understanding of the limits of time, so that I will sometimes feel like something has dropped in, and over the next week, it will actually crystallize right where it needs to. And that also leads to the leading I have in terms of the breadcrumbs along the trail kind of thing. So absolutely, it feels like a partnership, the podcast in general, as well as my life in general, which has really changed massively over the last 2 years, is all part and parcel of that same process.
Wow. Okay. This is something I understand. I have speculated cautiously. It's much more the first book, The Messengers, my first book on owls, really felt like, and I said it right in the writing. It is right there in print. I said it. And it's really tough for me to articulate. The only way I can say is it feels like the book was orchestrated by an outside source. I mean, I obviously pushed all the keys and typed all the words and did the research and, like I wrote it, but it felt like the whole process was orchestrated. I'd give a lot of examples of, synchronistic events of such high power that like I was in a constant state of awe in the writing, most particularly of that first book. Wow, this is something I understand very clearly. Point of convergence means there's multiple things converging. I would love to just make a list of what those things are. So it's NDEs, the near-death experience, the out-of-body experience, psi phenomena, and what else would be in that long list?
Well, I think encounters with apparitions would be in that as well. Any kind of anomalous experience that doesn't fall easily within conventional thinking, I think falls in there. But I also think here of the work of the Free Foundation, the Dr. Egg Mitchell Free Foundation, which has been rechristened CCRI more recently. And this relates to the huge study they did, the experiencer study / survey they did, where they allowed each of those different modalities to come in terms of how they looked at how people were impacted. So they called this the contact modalities. Ray Hernandez was the one that coined that term. And basically each of those different kinds of experiences tended to produce similar effects in the people who had them. That's why it was so interesting and why there seemed to be a point of convergence there. So that's what's been fascinating to me, is how people can have these different kinds of experiences, and it changed not only their worldview, but there also seems to be at least a correlation between, if you've experienced one of those modalities, you're more likely to experience one of the others than, say, a random person from the population. So that prompts really interesting questions around, is there something different about these people from birth? Or is it that a switch gets flipped, some sort of DNA gets activated, however you want to look at it in terms of the mechanism, where from then on, they have a different relationship with reality to some degree. For instance, even one of the people I like to mention is Elizabeth Crone, and she and Jeff Kripal wrote a book together called Changed in a Flash, and she had a near-death experience after being struck by lightning walking into a synagogue in Houston, and not only had an experience of what she perceived as kind of like heaven, and a person who looked and was familiar to her in terms of being like her grandfather walked her around this garden, and she kind of saw this as like a kind of godlike deity figure. Then came back because there was a couple heart surgeons in the synagogue that day. But what's interesting about that is that from then on, she began to have precognitive dreams about things that were going to happen in the future. And these were demonstrable things, even things like plane crashes. So the relationship, the intersection between each of those dynamics, to me, is really, really interesting.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I've met Elizabeth Crone at Jeff's conference. This was going back a couple of springs ago, probably 2 years ago right now, right around this time of year. And being in her presence, I was really struck by what like a grace that woman had. Really, really palpable. I probably talked to her for 5 minutes, and I just sensed it so thoroughly. I have not read the book, and it's my understanding she's just put out another book, and Sharon Hewitt Rowlett is running a small publishing house for people who are doing these very, very personal books. So she now has 2 books out. One of them was written by Jeff, or with Jeff, and the other one is all her. So one of the things that strikes me is her name. Her name is Crone. And meeting her, she radiated this wise woman energy that was so palpable. And the only definition of that energy would be of the crone, that sort of mythic state in the life of a woman. So that kind of symbolic dream language shows up in this mystery. And I think you must know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's another one of the really interesting data points, is how you also have this blending together of kind of literal events, but also things that are loaded with symbology. And that's so fascinating to me. And, I know that you've covered this in your discussion around owls and those kinds of things. Some of this is perhaps reducible to screen memories and that kind of thing, but there's much more than that going on, where these different synchronistic overlaps seem to point in similar directions, and symbology comes into it. That's fascinating to me as well. And, when I think back to some of my experiences, even, there's definitely some of that going on. And I remember having conversations with Bernardo Kastrup recently about these kinds of things. And in his book, Meaning in Absurdity, he talks about basically we have this assumption that we live in a physicalist world that's made up of a bunch of stuff, and that consciousness is a epiphenomenon of basically material arrangements in our brain. whereas he sees something like idealism being a much more robust way to describe reality, which ultimately means it's kind of like a dreamscape, and kind of like ultimate mind is hosting these kinds of dreams. And that when you look at some of the encounters recorded in the UFO phenomenon, some of them fit kind of like sci-fi expectations, but many, many don't. Many of them are just really, really strange. This is when the term high strangeness comes in that Jacques Vallée talked so much about in the 70s. And sometimes those kinds of events seem almost loaded with symbolic meaning, almost like what you might pick up in a dream. So Bernardo makes the point that in the same way that a dream might be very literal, or it might be loaded with symbology, in the same way that might be happening in what we perceive as physical reality, which might just be another modality of a dreamscape. And here I also think of the work of Carl Jung and his sense that basically physical reality, quote unquote, is basically the flip side of the coin of the collective unconscious. So these deeply dynamic meaning connections are happening, and then this gets manifested in physical reality. And when particularly meaningful connections happen, then you kind of get this arc that happens where you get these synchronicities. That's what it looks like on the surface when these deeper meaning connections are being had. So I think about that in terms of the phenomenon quite often.
Yeah, the archetype. The way I look at it is when reality is playing out in dream language, when a real event takes place and you can decipher the real event with the skills of, let's say, a dream analysis. So you're analyzing real life as if it were a dream. And that one little element has helped me so much, particularly in my research of the owl phenomena, that shows up. It's not just UFOs and contact events. It shows up with all kinds of highly charged human events. But it is that dream sense of a dream made real, a real life event that speaks in dream language. Yeah, I'm absolutely fascinated by that. And it has helped me so much to, I'm going to say, not to cling so tightly to certain aspects of this mystery. It's allowed me to loosen up a little bit and take a half a step back.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a couple experiences I could share around that, but what has become clear to me is that sometimes I have experienced events that are very clearly only happening for some of the people present, whereas other people are not being subjected to that same kind of reality frame, which again speaks to the remarkable capacity this phenomenon has to be able to deliver custom experiences to people. That you will have sometimes some people experience something, but they might be little distinctions between what they experienced. And then another group of people, perhaps the general public at large, doesn't notice anything at all. There are other times where, for me, like recently I had an experience where I was woken up by a woman's voice. And I've heard this voice a few times. It's not anyone I know in this world that I'm aware of, but the voice is familiar to me by now. And that's strange in itself, because often I think to myself, that's that familiar voice. But then also knowing that I can't map that to anyone here that I know in my waking life is a strange experience in itself. But then what will also happen is when I was woken up, the voice said to me, "Darren, wake up." That's literally what it said. So it had a double meaning of like wake up out of your dream state, because I literally was just waking up at that point. But it felt like that was a symbolically loaded message saying something more like, be aware, be vigilant, make sure you're watching for what's happening in your reality, in your daily waking state. And in addition, when I was woken up by that voice, I bolted upright, looked straight at my clock, and it says 4:44, right? So this has been the repeating numbers that I have experienced that always seem to be related to something that's trying to catch my attention. Something I'm supposed to note will happen right at that time. And it doesn't just show up on clocks with that time, but other kinds of media and whatnot will show triple fours whenever something of meaningful impact has happened. So that one was particularly interesting, and that happened within the last few weeks. And what was interesting, it was literally coming out of sleep, and Darren Wake Up is on the one hand talking about coming out of a sleep state into the waking reality, but felt much more like it was about staying vigilant in terms of my awareness going through my waking day. And what's interesting there for me is that I always know exactly what the symbolism is, or almost always anyway. Some people I know wrestle with that. What does this mean? But generally for me, I always know, even when it's a pretty obscure kind of symbolism, I have a way of translating it so it's very clear to me what it tends to mean.
Yeah. Here's a question for you. Was there a chapter of your life where this was not at the forefront of your life? And I'm asking this for myself. I'm asking for personal reasons. What was the process of you accepting these experiences in your life? And I'm asking that for a reason, because I went through a very difficult bunch of years where I was trying to make sense of these things as they just poured into my life.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think for me, it was a kind of stutter step process. It wasn't in one fell swoop. I've mentioned on a couple different interviews, I've also mentioned on the podcast that I had this one remarkable experience with a former partner of mine. We were in a hotel in 2005 when we saw an entity appear at the end of our bed in the early morning hours. And that was my first conscious experience anyway of something that was truly anomalous, that I just couldn't fit into any box that I had at the time. And I kind of just put it in the back of my mind for a long period of time. And it wasn't until much later that a combination of continuing to have strange experiences with this former partner of mine, and then also beginning to read about the lore and understand how this is not so atypical, I began to grok it and internalize it and basically accept it as real. And then I had what I like to call a series of synchronicities that happened over about a 2-year period, where they were preposterous in their extent and their regularity, to the point where it was almost like something was trying to hit me over the head with a sledgehammer. This is real. Pay attention, and adjust your perspective accordingly. That's when I really finally said, okay, I get it. To me, it's funny when I talk to some skeptics and debunkers, they'll be like, well, how do you know that you're just not seeing the numbers 337 just as often, but you're just only noticing when it's 444, like selection bias, basically. And I say to them, I'm fully aware of all those kind of biases to look out for. I'm fully aware that things might seem more synchronistic than they are because you're looking for it. But when I try to be as objective as I can and almost have like a scientific approach to it, still the level of preposterosity, is this term I've literally coined to describe it, is so off the charts. It's very clear to me that long ago did I leave the possibility that this could just be random and I'm just reading into it.
I laughed when you said you felt like you were being hit over the head with a 2x4. I have used that same metaphor for my own direct experience of exactly what you're describing. For me, I was in a state of astonishment, and it wasn't healthy. Like, it was too much. I was just continually in this high state of astonishment that these things were happening, and it wasn't working for me. Like, astonishment implies there's adrenaline and you're off balance, and it's too much to live that way. And what I found was so helpful, I had to formally make this decision. I had to formally tell myself I am no longer allowed to be astonished, but I am allowed to be in awe. And that one vocabulary word, the awe means something reverent, means something you appreciate, it's something you can honor, where astonishment is something else entirely. So that was so helpful for me and continues to be helpful for me even now.
Yeah, and for me, when I reflect on it, I was saying to a friend last night that this has kind of become the new reality for me, and it has been for a while, so I don't tend to be too shocked by it, but I'm certainly in awe. I'm certainly thankful. It certainly feels really profound to be part of something so much bigger than myself. I sometimes will describe to people that when people ask me about my perspective on free will, I will say, well, really the way I see it, the incarnated Darren in this reality is the vehicle of expression of an entity that's more like a metasoul, and that it's lensing intention through this vehicle that is Darren in this incarnation. And basically, for me, that's more about an attunement that happens. If I can tune to that flow, then things not only tend to go more smoothly for me, but they feel profoundly meaningful. And I feel like I'm going from one tiny stream and then merging with a much more powerful river that's carrying me along with it. And I'm somehow part of that. My higher self is part of that. And it's also a stream of consciousness even beyond that. And so that's been my experience. And I absolutely respond with gratitude. When I meditate, I always respond at the end with a sense of gratitude for being a part of this. And it makes life feel so meaningful. And generally, I accept that this is just the way things are. But once in a while, as I was saying to my friend last night on the phone, I will sometimes be making lunch or something, and I'll just pause and say, what the bleep? You know, like I'm just like, this is such a bizarre and profound and meaningful reality, but so incredibly different than the way I used to interface with reality that sometimes I feel like if my old self were to meet my recent self, he wouldn't even like him. He'd think he's like so strange that he couldn't find him relatable. So it really is remarkable how much it changes things. But on top of that, something I remember saying to Kelly is that basically this also tends to recontextualize your entire history. So you tend to look back at even earlier events and realize, wait a second, I think even those events were part and parcel of this ongoing journey that bring me to where I am now. And so that's really fascinating too. Even some of the well-known people in the field I've talked to personally, and they'll say, now I realize that thing that happened when I was 10, the reason I went to college, why I took this one degree program rather than this other one, all feel linked to this kind of breadcrumb process that goes right back to the beginning of their lives. So in that sense, it's even more profound the more you become familiar with that.
Wow, there's a lot there. I'm going to ask a few questions here. One is, you use the term this incarnation to describe your life here now. For me, that implies, okay, so what was before, and then what comes next? So this incarnation, your life now, and I'm saying this again for selfish reasons, because this is something I understand, and this is something I struggle with. But so what, do you have a sense of what your previous incarnation might have been?
Well, I will say this, and I haven't talked too much about this publicly, but I will say that there have been times where after the initial sort of contact experiences I had, and the first one after the hotel experience in 2005, I had another really strange kind of contact experience that was all telepathic, and I didn't even recognize it as that at the time. I wasn't really pursuing the UFO phenomenon at the time, but I basically had this prompting for a certain kind of protocol in meditation, which was different than anything I'd come across before. I'm a Zen Buddhist kind of meditator and follow those kind of protocols, but then I had this notion just come into my head, you should try this, you should do this, and I just did it without thinking about it. And then later on, had even a further revelation about how that should work. And this is partly how some of the downloads come in. But, what's interesting for me is that when I think about what I'm connected to, like what actually is this intelligence, this overarching thing I'm connected to, one of the things I like to point out to people is that I think the phenomenon is a plurality. I think that it's different kinds of beings, different kinds of origin sources involved, and also involving the fact that we ourselves are much more complicated and interesting, and I would say multidimensional than we give ourselves credit for. So sometimes I'm realizing that what I'm accessing feels like a higher version of myself, and it's, like I say, it's kind of crystallizing in this expression of this vehicle in this incarnation. But there have been some times where I have tuned into what feels like a collective intelligence. What I mean by that is that there's many different individuals involved, but it also harmonizes into a collective intelligence where there's a seamless integration and understanding amongst all these different entities. And the part that surprised me, like after the fact when I thought about it, but didn't seem strange at all during the experience, was that I was part of this collective intelligence. Though I wasn't just being spoken to and communicated with from it, but I was part of it. So, and I wouldn't even describe it as a previous incarnation. It feels like a simultaneously running incarnation right along with this one. And it's a modality I sort of jump back and forth between, often happens in meditation. So that's been my experience with a different kind of incarnation, but it basically is running in tandem with my usual waking state.
Whew, yeah. My experiences don't quite follow that. There seem to be more purposely orchestrated to meet my own personality type. So the experiences I've had and my definition of like what this incarnation means versus what my previous incarnation might have been versus what my future incarnation might be, like I can wrap my mind around that in a way that I never could have before just a few years ago. And it strays from your, like, I feel like I'm doing this as an artist. Like, I feel like I'm framing these things as as a creative act. So this is something I very much understand. Yeah. We talked a little bit just before we started recording, and I asked if you could tell a story. And part of the reason I did that is because I do a lot of podcasts. I'm partially trying to promote my books and such, and people ask me to go on podcasts. I always say yes. And I find that, wow, do I tell the same stories over and over and over again. And I don't want to put you through that. But let me say that your event in the hotel room that took place in 2005, you told beautifully on Kelly Chase's show. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes. So if folks want to hear that story in the hotel room, a very complete and thoughtful retelling of that, just look in the show notes and I'll provide a link to that show, which she did on Whitley Strieber's Dreamland. So I would love to just hear a story that would help me better understand, like, what's going on with you, like, presently, right now. Like, where have you arrived at?
Okay, so I think where I would pick up, and again, I could choose from numerous stories, and they all slot together in this larger narrative, and each one becomes a chapter in a larger, meaningful context for me. But one of the real turning points for me was around the time that the podcast was really gaining a lot of recognition. And it went from being this something I was doing on the side while also working as a software engineer full time, where I started being invited to different conferences to speak and even to participate in private retreats. So a couple of years ago, I was invited to attend a private retreat that was being held at the Monroe Institute. So it was held at the Monroe Institute, but it wasn't a program run by the Monroe Institute. We basically used the facilities and ran our own kind of program there. And it was attended by a combination of well-known experiencers, researchers, even former government people who had been researching the phenomenon for decades and been involved in even government research around it. And we did a combination of sort of psi phenomena kind of experiments in a kind of playful way during the daytime. And in addition to retiring to our bunks in the blacked out kind of cubicles that they have at the Monroe Institute, those who've been part of the programs will know what I mean. We also would gather in the meadow at night to basically take part in kind of like a CE5 event. Not everyone would call it that, but we went out there with a shared intention to have experiences with benevolent beings. And on each of the nights, we did spot phenomena that were anomalous. And we had numerous people there who were very familiar with the night sky and what was anomalous and what wasn't, what was conventional. So we would literally call out to each other, that's the International Space Station, that's Starlink, those kind of things. We would know if it was just a traditional satellite. We also could pull it up and find out which one it was. So when we did have anomalous experiences, it was very clear based on the behavior that it was anomalous. And we actually ended up submitting some of our footage to MUFON, and they returned with the same analysis, that this was anomalous, this was not traceable to any sort of known phenomenon. But what was most interesting for me is that afterwards, I began to receive these telepathic downloads immediately after the event, and those have continued unabated since then, basically. But one of the elements of those sightings, which was interesting to me, is they were all fairly subtle, right? So I will sometimes say to people, you won't necessarily see a flying saucer or a black triangle, but you will see things that are clearly behaving anomalously, but it might be a prick point in the sky kind of thing where this is happening. And so I remember that being a takeaway, and I remember actually discussing this in some podcast interviews, that, you know, you should make sure you pay attention, because if you're not, you might miss it. It won't necessarily be some great, sensational, dazzling thing in the sky. And I remember talking about that, and then I ended up going to someone else's house only a couple months after that, and we had several experiences that night. And one of them particularly was what to me felt like a huge part of the sky lit up. So something sort of just crystallized into existence from nothing and then lit up a huge part of the sky. And that was incredibly shocking for me, because I thought to myself, that was not subtle. That's not the kind of thing that if you're not looking, you're going to miss it. Like, this was really, really prominent. And it felt very purposeful. It felt like it was saying, something was saying to me, don't be so clear cut on what you think this is going to look like. The second that you try to draw it down and say, this is how it tends to manifest, we'll do something different. That's what I really felt from it, kind of telepathically as well. It was a meaningful way of expressing, in contrast to what I'd seen earlier that summer. And so for me, that was a really profound sort of bookmark, where I had these encounters with people at this event, but then this led to the telepathic downloads, which is the most important part of the entire experience, and then had this later event that was, contrasted with the earlier one where something showed up so obviously that it was not subtle. And in that moment, it also became clear to me, because there was 3 of us that saw it, that clearly nobody else in the city was seeing this, because if they were, people would be calling the fire department, they'd be calling the Air Force, they would think there's some sort of invasion going on, because it was not subtle. So if everybody was seeing it, then there would have been panic. But there clearly wasn't. So that, again, showed me that this phenomenon has the capacity to sometimes put on subtle displays and sometimes pretty brilliant displays, but custom deliver them to the consciousness of the people that it intends to. And of course, that raises really interesting questions about the mechanism of that. But nevertheless, that's been the reality for me.
Yeah, custom delivered. Yeah, this is something that I sense very strongly, that these events are tailored to the individual in such a profound, clear way. So you're familiar with Robert Monroe as far as the Monroe Institute.
Yeah.
So he pioneered something called hemisync audio, which is 2 sets of beats that are run through a headset, and they are just slightly different. And those, I think he uses the term binaural beats, would then, on the simplest level, would allow for a beginner to get into a meditative state much more quickly. In some examples, people have out-and-out mystical experiences or paranormal experiences because of these binaural beats. Obviously, you're familiar with Eben Alexander.
I am, yes.
Yeah, so he has been putting out his own set of updated, the binaural beats that Robert Monroe was creating. I think those came out of the 1970s. Correct me if I'm wrong.
That sounds right.
Yeah, and then Eben Alexander is putting out a set of updated with using a little more modern technology and a little higher tech recording and production techniques. He's been putting out his own set of binaural beats, which I find is, to me, this is remarkable that, let me back up. It should be remarkable. It feels kind of ordinary, and at the same time, where someone who had a profound near-death experience would then return and then take on this new role as, I don't want to say promoting, but offering this technique for meditation. That you must understand how what I'm trying to say here is that, one powerful event led to another powerful event.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think because he's a neurosurgeon, right? So what's so profound and compelling about his particular case is that if anyone would be able to, explain this away, it would be him, because he understands brain science. He was a pretty reductionistic materialist at the time that he had this experience. And only because he had this mind-blowing experience where his brain was basically effectively dead, it was non-existent in terms of neurochemical activity in his brain, and yet he had this most profound experience of his life. But when he came back, obviously because he is a neurosurgeon and he understands to some degree that even if we think about our brains being kind of like quantum transducers of non-local consciousness, we can still do things to help that interface with larger reality. And there's all sorts of evidence to suggest that our usual waking state is a very suppressed and filtered version of reality. And there's a variety of techniques that I'm really interested in that allow us to access what is actually more of reality, not something that is divergent from reality, but it's more of reality, that we have to realize that what we're actually experiencing as reality in our waking state is a limited kind of truncated version of reality, sometimes even translated into something different altogether. So with him working on hemisync kind of technology, and there, by the way, for those that don't know, hemisync refers to hemispheric synchronization, right? So the 2 hemispheres of the brain, by playing these 2 different tones, are able to sync together the activity of the 2 hemispheres of the brain, which does put people basically into the beginnings of a meditative type experience, which allows them to sort of drop into a different kind of modality where they then become aware of this more extensive reality. So I think that's fascinating. I think that there's much research we should do there. There's already plenty of evidence to suggest that psychedelics access this in some ways. There's recognition now that basically part of our brain seems to be suppressing our ability to perceive things. And there's even been research done where if you suppress a certain part of the brain's function, people have greater psychic experiences. So it does seem to be the case that there is some sort of genetic component, which speaks to what I was saying before about after people have had these contact modality experiences, they seem to have this augmented capacity to perceive even across time. Well, we also may get to the point where we are able to wield different neurological processes to aid that as well. But I am fascinated by and definitely interested in continuing to pursue these different kinds of ways, these different techniques that we can begin to facilitate those experiences for people.
Wow. So earlier I said, these events are orchestrated for the individual. And I can think of no better example than the near-death experience that Eben Alexander experienced. Feels like, I can't prove this, right? But it sure feels like it was orchestrated directly for him, and not just for him personally, but I would say it was orchestrated for the collective. He wrote a very, very popular book, or a series of books, but the one book was really groundbreaking, and he was on just all kinds of mainstream news sources talking about his near-death experience. Like literally, I think he more than anyone broke down that wall that kept the near-death experience sort of hidden away from the populace, and it was only, treated as something, as woo-woo, or I don't know what the right term would be, something that was easily dismissed. But his role, more than anyone, changed the way we think of the near-death experience, and that feels orchestrated.
Exactly. I agree with that. I think that when you look back, you realize that people are picked to some degree based on the role they will play. And some people have even considered this almost like an intelligence operation, and sometimes a counterintelligence operation, where basically people are picked not necessarily because they are the only kind of people that can deliver this kind of message, but that the role they will play fits within this larger context. And I know that some people have even been frustrated when their role is finished, that sometimes some of the contact drops off, at least for a period of time. And so then people's egos get involved and whatnot. And I think it is helpful to realize there is some sort of larger orchestration happening to some end, like there is a goal in mind. And again, people like Vallée, even back in the 70s, began to postulate that this control system was designed to basically steer the course of human civilization without us fully being able to grok that that's what it was doing. So it kind of happens on the margin, sometimes works with some pretty obscure people, but in just such a way that everything gets micro-shifted so that in the end, the result is inevitable nevertheless. So that's what I think about there. And I agree with you, as someone like Eben Alexander, what better person to speak to the validity of a near-death experience than someone who works in brain science, right? And basically worked on diseased and dying brains. So he knows that of which he speaks. And he's going to be taken more seriously than anyone else in the field, basically. So I agree, that feels orchestrated in itself.
He wasn't just any old brain surgeon either. He was the head of I think I've got this correct, he was the chair of the brain surgery department at the Harvard Medical School.
Yeah.
And let me ask this. I listened to a bunch of your shows, and you referenced that you had done shamanic work, or you were doing shamanic work. Are you still involved in that at all?
I would say most recently I have been doing sort of a comparative analysis between elements common to both shamanism and ufological kind of experiences. So there was actually someone who did a PhD. Their dissertation was on comparing the elements between the two. And there was a remarkable amount of crossover. And some people have suggested that the ufological experience, the UFO phenomenon experience, is a lot like an initiation experience that you find in shamanism. And because the typical, these are ETs coming from Alpha Centauri, seems much too simplistic to describe what's really going on, I think somehow it is all related. I have been doing some of my own work, and I probably in the future will very likely lead shamanic journeys for other people and make that part of the retreats that I lead as well. But that'll be in the future. Right now, I'm just sort of diving back into the whole thing and how it's connected.
That's really fascinating, because what I'm finding is that in my work, which is mostly focused around UFOs and owls, there's other modalities beyond just UFOs that are connected too, but I'm finding that I'm meeting a lot of shamans. Everything seems to be tracing back to some sort of shamanic experience or some shaman-like experiences. And have you read the works of Michael Harner? He wrote a book called The Shaman's Way, as well as a book called Cave and Cosmos.
I have, yeah. I've read, I think The Shaman's Way is the one that I read.
So I've read Cave and Cosmos, but not The Shaman's Way. I read that. It felt like I was listening to the stories that UFO experiencers tell me. That kind of dream logic to their stories was showing up in the shamanic journeys that he was presenting in this, like basically the second half of his book was just one shamanic journey after another. It's not the same, but it had a very similar flavor and tone of the accounts, the dreamlike accounts that show up in the lives of people who have had what I would call the direct contact experience. And that left me really in awe. Who was the academic who did the comparison between the UFO experiences and the shamanic experiences?
I wish I could remember them off the top of my head, but I do not remember. It was a PhD student who literally that was their dissertation, was on the parallels, but I couldn't remember the name at the moment.
So, and also that was the thrust of John Mack's final book. Dr. John Mack wrote a book called Passport to the Cosmos, where he compared and contrasted the UFO contact experience with the shamanic initiation experience. And I read that book very early on as I was struggling to make sense of my own experiences, and it really helped me frame what I was going through in a different way than, beings from Zeta Reticula on their metal spaceship. I think we're both in agreement that is far too simplistic to sum up the strangeness and the complexity of what seems to be going on.
Yeah, I agreed. And what's interesting is, because of my work with the John Mack Institute, I've had conversations with the people who initially talked to John about shamanism and indigenous cultures in general and their encounters. So when he was back in the 90s trying to wrestle through what is this, what is happening, it seems certainly real based on his expertise as someone who reads people. He feels like they were being true to the best of their ability and that their bodies were showing real signs of having an actual experience and that kind of thing you can't fake. But he also really, really wrestled with in what realm of reality or what mode of consciousness is this happening, partly because we don't have a lot of abundance of evidence in some physical ways that you might expect, but furthermore, because even the experiencers themselves describe it as being like an alternate state of consciousness or happening in an alternate realm. And so people said to him when he was wrestling through this and trying to talk to the mainstream and media and whatnot, some friends said to him, you need to go talk to indigenous cultures. And apparently he said, oh, really? And they're like, oh, yes, this has been happening to them for their entire history. And they think it's peculiar that we think it's new. So then he began to seek out these people, including indigenous cultures here in America, and then also going to Africa and finding their different tribes that had for generations spoken about encounters with beings that are something like the gray alien, which I think they called the Mantandine. And yeah, for him, it became clear that it's more the Western civilization's way of making sense of reality that's the problem. That for some of these other cultures, not only was it not so weird, but for them, they didn't even make this sharp distinction between what we might call the dream world and what we might call the real world. For them, it was all part of a spectrum of existence and consciousness. And I think that's a big clue that we need to move towards. And you could argue that the UFO phenomenon is moving us towards that just by the nature of the experiences.
I agree completely. And my sense is that this is not a new phenomena. It did not begin in 1947, and that it traces back to the dawn of, in my opinion, it traces back to the dawn of man, and it's been part of the human experience since we stepped out of the cave, or since, it's been
right.
Absolutely part of our core experience. And as I said earlier, like I'm seeing this through the eyes of an artist, in a way, and just the cave paintings that show up in ancient cultures, like in France and in Australia, those are so rich and beautiful, and those are theorized to be part of a shamanic process. Like literally, the cave is integral to the shamanic framework,
right?
As the underworld. I feel that it's baked into our bones as a creature, and we in the West are ignoring it, I'm speculating. I don't know if this is true, but it sure feels true. My sense is that the UFO contact experience, and let's say other modalities like the near-death experience, are creating shamans. The people who go through the experience come out the other end. If they're not doing work as a shaman, they're doing a shaman-like work where they're acting as a therapist in that sense, or they're doing Reiki, which is really common for people who have had these experiences.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. And again, it's one of those things where you look back at your life and you see this remarkable kind of string of events that somehow work together in a way that didn't seem obvious then, but do now. And so it's very interesting to me that I was really interested in shamanism when I was in California from around 2010 to 2018 and was leading shamanic journeys at that time for people. Little did I know I would later on tie that in with my own experiences and then also with the UFO phenomenon in general. And like I said earlier, some of my meditation experiences as part of a Zen Buddhist practitioner also play in here. So somehow all of this is connected. And something else is interesting is I'm aware of some, in sort of the connections I've made, which have been really profound. I'm sure they have been for you as well. Some connections I've made around the world. There's just one family in Europe, and I'm not going to identify them too precisely, but basically one of their children has remarkable capacities off the charts, and they have had this calling to work towards these kind of cures for certain kinds of diseases. And this child has a memory of being on a different planet as a different kind of being. And on the one hand, he's born into a culture in Europe that's very secular, that's very anti-supernatural or anything woo. But in this particular case, it turns out that his dad is one of very, very few shamans in that area and practices shamanism. And because of that, that has been the bridge that has allowed him to make sense of what's going on with his son, even though it still stretches his imagination sometimes in terms of what's going on. But the remarkable intelligence of this child and how they have shown this amazing capacity to understand the human medical sort of system and how our biological processes work. And that has even done some research tied to a kind of plant that is found in the Amazon and how that might be related to the future cure for cancer. This is all happening for this kid that's still a teenager, a young teenager. And it's interesting that it's only because his dad happens to be one of the few shamans in that entire country that he's able to grok this and land it somewhere.
Wow. Yeah, so let me tell a real quick story here. And this is a story I really love. It's a very simple story. It involves an owl. There's no UFO in the story, but it has everything to do with the power of the owl. A young boy, he was 12 years old at the time, he contacted me as an adult. He's Native American. He was growing up on a reservation in Michigan. I didn't even know the reservation was there. I had to look it up on a map, and it doesn't look like much on a map. It looks like a neighborhood, really. So he was in a field. He was flying a kite, and this was a kite he loved. And it was way up high in the sky, the kite, and there was a big gust of wind, and the ball of string got pulled out of his hands, and the ball of string and the kite, flew off into the woods, and he saw where it went. And it went into the forest, and then he got a friend. He said, I want to find that kite. I love this kite. And they walked into the forest, and they saw the kite at the top of a tree. So they walked to the base of the tree, and there was an owl that was all wrapped up in the string. It was all tangled up in the string. It would have died if they hadn't gone in. So they got an adult, and they came back, and they cut the string off with a scissor, and the owl was actually injured, and it needed to recover, and they eventually let the owl go. And he told me this story. Now, what I said next is going to tell you a lot about the kinds of stories I receive and the patterns I've been seeing. He told me that story, and I said, are you a shaman? And he said, oh man, in a word, yes. And I don't want to say too much, but his role as a shaman was not easy. It was very difficult, which is also, in my opinion, tied into the lore of the owl, where it seems to be a totem of a challenge, of something difficult. Because it's difficult doesn't make it bad, but it certainly can be challenging, and his experiences reflected that. Now, that story, that sounds like a dream. If someone had told that story, let's say to Carl Jung, like they're going through analysis and they're lying on the couch, and they told that dream to Carl Jung, he would have been able to look at it symbolically. But it was a real life event with this dream language embedded into it, which I talked about earlier. And I'm just curious your thoughts on a story like that and how it ties into so much in this elusive field.
Yeah, like you, I hear a lot of those kind of stories and have had my own experiences that feel eerily symbolic in the way that they are delivered, to the point where sometimes people, I think, leap to the conclusion, oh, were you in a dream state or a hypnagogic state or something when that happened? Because it's so wrapped up in symbology, and people assume that's only in the realm of the dream world. And again, according to John Mack's work and the people that he encountered, that's a division that we kind of arbitrarily overlay on reality, assuming that the things that happen in the waking world that we can measure, that we count as real, and everything else is kind of subjective mush, whether it's feelings of love or encounters we have in dream states or psychedelics or whatever. But to me, what this is opening up is the re-enchantment of the world, is what it really comes down to. Because when you realize you can have these experiences in the waking world as well, that are so rich in symbolism, it makes you look at every event of your life so differently. So rather than what we're taught conventionally, that events just happen for no particular purpose, but actually you look now at signs. You look for signs. It's a very different way of orienting yourself towards life when you wake up every morning with the mentality that I'm going to be aware of the signs and keep my eye open, be vigilant, which speaks to what I said earlier about being woken up by that female voice. Darren, wake up. Again, in the sense I got, the symbology for me was be aware, pay attention, look for the signs, look for the breadcrumbs along the trail. And that, to me, completely changes the way we look at our lives. It re-enchants the world, and it brings so much more meaning and purpose to our lives that's been largely robbed in conventional thinking.
Ooh. Oh, I couldn't agree more. I wrote down re-enchantment of the world. That is a beautiful way to say it. Yeah, someone came up to me at a conference, at a UFO conference. This was very early on, before I was still very fragile at that point as far as my understanding of my role or how it played into my life. And someone said, "Hey, you've had these experiences, you've had these." Yeah, I talked a little bit about the stuff that had been happening to me, and he said, "So how has this changed your life?" That was a good question, and I had to think for a little bit. And I said, "I now live in a magical universe, which I feel is true. It doesn't make it necessarily easy all the time, but I do recognize the magic of these powerful events that play out symbolically, or that play out like paranormal, or as a portent to something greater, much richer than my junior high school science teacher. The way he framed the world is not how I see it anymore."
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a piece that I would want to bring in there too is that this also highlights the fact that we are co-authors in our existence as well. Co-authors in even the events of our lives, in the script, if you will, that is laid out before us in this grand re-enchanted kind of story. So in that sense, if someone goes through the world convinced that there's no meaning to it and there's no symbolism to pay attention to, all of that is just make-believe, then largely to a large extent, that will be fed back to them. Now, as you and I talked about before we went on the air, there are times where the phenomenon says, I'm going to get your attention come hell or high water. That happens as well. But I also have noticed that when people turn into this and begin to engage with it, that's when it becomes this kind of cooperative process where we also play a role in co-authoring what happens. So it's not just about reading the tea leaves that are coming your way, but more of an interactive kind of experience. And to me, that's just as fascinating and adds even more enchantment to the entire process.
Wow. Yeah, I went through a time of like really strong, unrelenting synchronicities. It lasted about 7 years. It was like it was a rough chapter of my life. And I had to like formally decide, like, no, like I cannot be knocked off base by this. So I needed to be less frantic. Like I was in a frantic chapter of my life, and I was receiving these frantic synchronicities. They were too much. They were too intense. They were too overwhelming. And I needed to dial back my own personal energy and be a little calmer, which happened under through a lot of work on my part, really. But so as I got calmer, the synchronicities didn't stop, but I was receiving calmer, more playful, more gentle synchronicities. It felt like the universe was a mirror and it was reflecting back my energy. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I have said to people for a while now that there is this reflective nature to this, even to the point where I think when people think about engaging in various activities that might put them in contact with some sort of non-human intelligence, non-conventional intelligence, they should first be aware of their energetic state. So one of the things I teach in my classes with Essence of Being is energetic awareness. And that begins with yourself. You have to learn to tune into your somatic self and really know what's going on. Many people don't. Many people in our society are so cerebral that they really are out of touch with their bodies. So that's part of a shamanistic aspect too, that by being aware of that, you become cognizant of the fact that you are seeding that into the field, as it were, and you might get reflected back to you whatever you're putting in. So when it comes to something like CE5, the research I've done suggests that the vast majority of the time those produce positive experiences. And a big reason for that largely is because part of the protocol is to sort of dial up a very positive, benevolent kind of sense and a desire to connect with other similarly minded, benevolent beings. And that tends to be what follows. Of course, sometimes what will happen is somebody at the last minute will join a group going out to do a CE5 experience, and a group that usually has contact experiences suddenly won't, because the coherent field has shifted because of that one person that maybe was bringing a certain vibe that just didn't cohere with the rest, and that actually prevented the experience from happening. And in a similar token, when I've heard of the few cases where there were negative experiences, which again is very, very few, there's usually mitigating circumstances, like someone is going in actually with energy that's more negative than they're aware of. And so what I like to say in my class, for instance, this is the number we're calling, right? So whatever number we call plays a large role in who's going to pick up on the other end of the line. And so that's why it really behooves us to be aware of our own state. And if you are feeling a lot of anger, resentment, fear, shame, any of these sort of low frequency kind of vibrations, that's maybe not the time to do these contact experiences. So absolutely, this speaks again to the co-authoring of the entire process.
You brought up the essence of being, and we talked about this privately before the conversation began. What is that?
So this sort of ties in with the telepathic downloads I started getting after my experience at the Monroe Institute. And what became really clear to me was that for us to meet the challenges we are facing as a civilization, we have to fundamentally change how we see ourselves and our relationship with each other, with the planet, with the larger biome, with this cosmic family that we're slowly being introduced to. And that was more important than some sort of cerebral change. Again, it had to be more of a felt sense. And the goal was to help people have a more embodied sense of who they were. And so it's a combination of curriculum and practices we use, kind of shamanic in a way, to try to make people more acquainted with this. And so that produced Essence of Being, basically. And it was a really, really interesting series of synchronicities. And I mentioned to you privately that there was a period of time where things kind of just got cleared off my plate, because it's, again, as we often hear, this phenomenon, this intelligence, seems to know us better than we know ourselves. And so in my case, I probably would have had a hard time deciding to move in a certain direction because it wasn't the most conservative thing to do. And I tend to be pretty conservative in the steps I make. At least I used to be that way. And then it's as if the phenomenon said, how about we just wipe all this out then? And not in a negative way, but there were some changes that happened that said, okay, you're going to have to do something different now. And then it was much easier for me to embrace that. But that was right around the time I started getting these downloads around what would Essence of Being about and how would I teach it. And I remember, again, I can sometimes be a perfectionist. And there was a period of time where I was saying to myself, or saying to the field, if you will, I will just keep working on perfecting this curriculum, and eventually, sure enough, I'll start offering classes. And then I had a very, very clear message say, no, you'll do it now, and then you'll do it again, and you'll do it again, and you'll do it again. And it's because practicing it in the field with people, with the energy as it's arising, will make you really, really skilled. But you have to get in, you have to do it. You can't just talk about it. You can't think about it. You can't just jot down ideas. You have to get in and do it. And that will make you more adept over time. So that's what I did. And it was right around that time also that people from the John Mack Institute were moving these boxes of all of John's archives that were sitting in boxes in Cambridge. They were taking them in a U-Haul truck down to Rice University in Houston to be put into the archives of the impossible. And it turns out that the driver of the truck, of the U-Haul van, was a fan of my podcast and started playing it. And so this really resonated in terms of the way that I spoke about the phenomenon, the depth and breadth of it, and my own personal experience with it. And so that led to me coming on as the communications director for the John Mack Institute. And part of the initiative that was on the plate there was this notion called the Humankind Project, which was about seeding these examples of new ways of being humanity. So taking groups of people in different parts of the world and beginning to operate under a different economic model, different energy kind of model. But for me, what was really clear was that a new model alone, while that is necessary, is insufficient to meet the challenges we're facing, that we also have to fundamentally see ourselves differently and our connection to everything. And so those two projects, the Humankind Project and Essence of Being, seamlessly fit together and have become two of the major initiatives that the John Mack Institute will be focused on over the next year. So all of that happened synchronistically, and it's, again, taught me that there's something happening much beyond me, and it's more about me tuning into that, joining that larger river as I'm carried along by it.
I use that river analogy a lot as far as my own life experience and my own comfort proceeding forward. And you're a Buddhist, so obviously the middle path. You get tangled up in the weeds on one side of the river, and you get swept down too fast in the rapids on the other. You got to find the middle path and go with the flow.
Yeah, absolutely. It really is amazing. And there's nothing like that feeling of knowing that you're part of something larger than yourself. It's interesting because we are a society that is very focused on self-empowerment. And while that is part of what we need to embrace, and we do want to champion human rights and those kinds of things, and the right for the individual to make their own decisions and control their own destiny to some degree, but I think we do ourselves a disservice if we don't realize that what feels most profound to us and most meaningful, in the same way that a chord sounds so much richer than an individual note, that if we can find that larger thrust of consciousness that we are sort of called to be a part of, that is the most enriching experience, in the same way that a chord is more enriching than an individual note. And what I would also say is that everyone has that place to find. Everyone has that river they can join up with. And so that's what I also encourage people, is to tune into that. And that involves partly becoming quiet and silent and still long enough that you can begin to hear this and experience this, right? So in our modern world, where we've got screens in front of us constantly, and we can stream Netflix shows until, we go to bed basically, and then we get up and do the whole thing again. And because we're lacking so much stillness and silence, we don't have a chance to sometimes notice these things that are always there, but are being crowded out by the busyness of our modern lives. So that's another part of the shamanizing of modern society that I kind of feel called to be a part of.
I did outdoor work for a long time, and I would do 30-day trips in the mountains. So, the bus would drop us off somewhere in Alaska, and the team would walk out into the mountains for 30 days, and then we would come back, and pretty much it was your small group, usually around 12 to 15 people. We called it a media fast. This was really before the advent of the really oppressive presence of the smartphone in our lives. But wow, was that a beautiful experience to just go out and not have music. We could sing, but we didn't have music. We didn't have any stimuli beyond what nature would offer us and what we could offer each other. It was so enriching and so powerful, and I miss it so much. It was a lot of work, yeah, but it was that was a beautiful 20 years of my life where I was doing that work.
That sounds amazing, and I would love to be a part of those kind of things in the future too. Like, one of the things I'm doing with Essence of Being, in addition to the online courses, is these in-person retreats that happen, basically in nature to some degree. I'm hosting a retreat in June that'll be happening in this cabin right backed up against the national forest in Idaho. And I'm looking forward to that as well. People getting together We will even have drum circles in the evenings, those kinds of things, and leaving our phones behind. I think that's going to be profound and surprisingly such a rare experience in our modern life.
Exactly. And it is the human experience since the dawn of man. It's only in the last generation that we've been crowded out by television and radio, or the last few generations, really, and now the smartphone.
Yeah.
Hey, as I was doing the research for this interview, I would listen to your shows and I would just kind of jot down notes. And this is just something I wrote down, and it was just folded into one of your shows. You said you were talking about free will and how it can feel subverted by the phenomena.
Yeah, I think this again is interesting because that's one way of looking at it. And then a larger context sort of comes down to, where do you locate the I? So again, part of my background as a Buddhist practitioner is this sense that there's the small self and there's this larger self, the kind of delineated by a capital S sometimes, which refers to sort of source consciousness that we're all a part of. So on the one hand, if you highly identify with the small self, this body mind that has been around for a few decades and was born to such and such people in this particular part of the world at this particular time, then sometimes, first of all, the shock of the phenomenon is that gets stripped away from you. And for someone who's really attached to that sense of small self ego, it feels like they're being attacked. They will sometimes interpret it that way. Whereas again, as you and I both know, a huge part of the shamanic journey is ego death and aligning with this larger sense of a larger biome kind of thing. And even that's why many of these indigenous cultures don't see themselves as distinct from each other nor from the environment. So if you have that really, again, truncated sense of self, then you're going to feel like your will is being subverted by this phenomenon because it seems to take over and direct the course of your life. And as you and I talked about privately, sometimes that's subtle and sometimes it's not subtle at all. But I think what it's trying to do, or at least one of the consequences, is that it reunites us with this larger sense of I, which is, again, speaking to that metaphor of a chord versus an individual note, is much more fulfilling ultimately. So while some people will interpret it as an attack and as a kind of death experience, that, as you and I both know, gives way to a much more profound sense of self that's part of something much larger. So to me, it's a necessary transition, and depending on how locked in someone is on the small self ego, it will either be seen as something traumatic and violent almost, or as something transcendent and beautiful. And it really comes down to where you are in your own sort of ego process.
Yeah. Where you are in that river, how you are flowing downstream in that river is something that I need to monitor all the time. Like, I don't want to be stuck in the weeds, and I don't want to be frightened in the rapids.
Right. Or even if you just look at it like, wait a second, I'm an individual. What am I doing in this river? And you start trying to swim upstream, right? That's going to feel like it takes a lot of effort. It's going to be perhaps interpreted as something's trying to kill me. This water is trying to overcome me. Whereas if you instead interpret it as, I am part of this boundary between myself and the river is porous, and that I can locate myself at different points along the spectrum, and that this body mind is just one particular refraction of who I am, then that can really change your relationship with the river, and that changes your experience as well.
Yes, the river is a giant, living, breathing, flowing consciousness that we're tied into. Another thing that I wrote down as I was listening to one of your episodes, you spoke about Michael Talbot, the author of The Holographic Universe. That book had such a profound impact on me at a very important chapter of my life. I went through a phase where, wow, was I reading a lot of books. And that one in particular has always stood out as like, this was a chapter of my life where I would soon be stepping into, like, where I would have to address the UFO experiences in my life. And it felt like I was having the book experience that Jeff Kripal often talks about. And I had to, like, I was preparing myself for this next chapter of my life through books. And that book resonated so strongly with me, and it helped me frame the way I see the world around me in such a beautiful way.
Yeah, and for me, this is again one of the synchronicities, because I read that book years ago and was impacted by it then, but felt, again, led to reread it again this last year. And in so doing, it really helped to fill in the gaps of some things and connect some things together. And I have been pursuing the model of idealism as a sort of working model of maybe the way reality is structured rather than physicalism. And that's been really fruitful. And I've been paying attention to developments in neuroscience as well as physics that are pointing in that direction, that there's something prior to and beyond space-time, that space-time and even quantum theory are sort of epiphenomena of some deeper structure, some deeper process. And what's fascinating about the holographic model, or the hollow movement, as he sometimes refers to it there, same sort of thing in the sense that these two different theorists, Pribram and Bohm, working in different fields, one in neuroscience, one in physics, basically came to the same notion that this holographic way of picturing reality seemed the best way to make sense of each of the fields and the data that was arising in those fields. So independently, they came to this conclusion, and it's very much in the same sort of frame as idealism. And what's also interesting is that you take, for instance, a bit of holographic film, and what you basically see is these interpenetrating fields, basically, that are one-dimensional, and they don't look anything like the vibrant three-dimensional world we live in. But if you shine a laser through it, then suddenly it will project and produce this very three-dimensional world, and it's all its vibrance and everything. And you can move around it, and it looks to actually have three-dimensionality to it. And then, of course, even astrophysicists began to recognize, in trying to understand how information was seemingly destroyed when, for instance, light passed through a black hole, it was swallowed up forever, which seemed to go against the notion that energy is always conserved, even if it changes form. But then they began to realize, wait a second, you can store all of the information about what went into the black hole around the rim of the black hole, and that would be sufficient to project that reality back into existence again as a 3D kind of form. And then that led some astronomers to say, wait a second, maybe our entire universe is like that we are living within something like a hollow movement where the information is stored around the rim of the universe. And of course, for those of us within the hologram, we wouldn't have any way of knowing the difference, except that sometimes in these alternate states, we experienced a different kind of reality. So for me, that also plays in terms of how these different intelligences and even different people work together to sort of collapse the waveform into one particular manifestation of physical reality. That if you think about a hologram is basically a film with interference patterns on it, in the same way, we each are emitting into the cosmos a kind of frequency, and that interpenetrates with other frequencies from other conscious agents and ends up producing the meaning patterns that collapse physical reality into existence, at least apparently, in our midst. So this became a way for me also to really helpfully understand what's going on, and it helped me understand the phenomenon and how we interact and how we are co-authors in the process. It's really, really fascinating, and that's, again, one of these trails I've been led on with the breadcrumbs. And I agree with you, that book has been really influential in terms of helping that process.
Yeah, what I took away from it, I remember so clearly, and it still resonates strongly with me. You know, if you create a hologram, let's say, of a man, standing man, and then, you know, this would be a two-dimensional piece of glass, in essence, and then you smash the glass, and then you pick up one little piece of the glass, and then you shine a laser beam through that little fleck of glass. You know, logic would say, you know, you might find the shoelace, a close-up of the shoelace in that little teeny chip of glass, the shoelace that the man is wearing and is connected to his shoes. But that's not what you find. You find the entire, the entire man, the entire image in its totality in the tiniest fleck of that. And this, for me, that helps me wrap my mind around how, like, a remote viewer can read the future and the past and things that are on the other side of the galaxy and things that are happening. You know, I mean, Ingo Swann talked about stuff on the moon and stuff like that. That model gives me a better way in to wrapping my mind around these grand mysteries.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have an expression I like to say sometimes, which is, everything is everything, and I am that, and so are you. And that speaks to this. And you even think about the poet Rumi, had this famous saying where he said, "You are not a drop in the ocean, you are the ocean in a drop." And it's the same sort of notion that we are the totality. We are fractal impressions of source consciousness itself, which means we have access to the totality. So even when you think about a notion like the Akashic Records, where everything that's ever happened, every experience ever, every memory of every sentient life form in the history of the cosmos is recorded, and we have access to that because we are that. That's, again, speaks to what I'm getting at with Essence of Being, that when you have that much more overarching sense of who you are in terms of your potential, that you are everything, and that literally you can develop skills to be able to access more of that. And like you say, people that are accessing psi phenomena, it's not magic, it's just that they're naturally accessing aspects of ourselves that we all have access to because we all are fractal impressions of the entire thing. So absolutely, that helps make sense of so much of this.
Yeah. So Michael Talbot worked with Bud Hopkins. Michael Talbot was an experiencer who had UFO contact experiences. I don't know if you knew that or not.
I didn't know about the part about the experiences, no, but it makes sense. I know that he sort of made mention of that sometimes without going into detail in the book.
Yeah, I mean, he's both Bud and Michael Talbot are gone now, but there is some interview. Someone else told me about this. I have not found the interview, but someone told me there was an interview where he talked about it publicly during his life. For me, that does not surprise me at all. That is exactly what I have come to expect for people who have the UFO contact experience, is that they would do something like Michael Talbot did and write a powerful, important book about the nature of reality. And this also plays into Diana Walsh-Pasulka's book, American Cosmic, where she went and spoke with scientists. And also she followed that up with a more recent book called Encounters, where she was basically talking to these people who had experienced UFO contact, or what we would call UFO contact, and their important role in the sciences, which again speaks to this mystery. I have since come to expect that kind of thing. And my focus has been, like, the people I'm meeting and the people I'm bumping into synchronistically, or let's say fate, or putting our paths together. These people are much more on the artist side of things. So I'm seeing Diana Walsh-Pasulka had like an intention of looking into the scientific aspect thing, and she was meeting these scientists. I feel very strongly motivated to meet the creative types, and I'm meeting exactly those types. So again, I'm putting the energy out, and it's reflecting back in such a profound and rewarding way for me.
Yeah, and absolutely. I'm in agreement that so much of our inspiration is tapping into this interconnected field, and that's true for artistry and it's true for science. I don't want to name these people specifically, but I'm also aware of people that are scientists, that are physicists, that are, world-class physicists who are getting their own kind of downloads and then using that to craft new physics. And this is not just sort of them accidentally tapping into the field. It's very much a cooperative process between these different kinds of what some people would call alien intelligences and human beings who are trying to make breakthroughs in our understanding of physics for the precise purpose of trying to address some of the energy challenges we are having and that we're facing as a civilization. So absolutely. And what's ironic is that, again, you can have a society like our modern physicalist-based kind of society and say that none of that actually happens. But it doesn't change the fact that that's actually the mechanism that even people like Gary Nolan have spoken about. He goes to sleep at night thinking about some sort of challenge he's trying to address in cancer research or something. And he now knows enough about this process to sort of prepare himself and say, I'm trying to figure out how A relates to B, which relates to C. And he'll sort of make a mental model. And then he'll go to sleep. And then whatever he's accessing while he's sleeping allows him to make some connections that he wakes up in the morning with an answer. So I think this is much more common than people realize. And what's ironic about it is that many people experience it and then just don't really pay attention to how it's actually happening. But even, some of our most famous musicians and artists will say the same thing, that they feel like they're sort of grounding it into our reality, but it's coming from somewhere else. They don't really feel like they're writing it any more than they're actually channeling it. So absolutely, I think this is a huge aspect of how civilization actually develops, and we just haven't been paying attention.
Yeah. Hey, we've been at it for a little over an hour, it looks like. let me add my one final question here. Do you sense that something is at play and that something is ramping up?
Yeah, it's a great question. I definitely spend a lot of time thinking about that, and my close circle of friends, we are thinking about that, and not just thinking about it in the abstract, but trying to really draw together different bodies of data to build that argument or the counter if it's not true. But when I look at what's happening, it certainly seems that that's the case. And this sort of relates to what we were talking about earlier, where this reality that we experience is not just this sort of fluke, accidental mixture of elements that has no purpose or direction, but rather that the entire thing seems to be more like a script that's leading to some sort of ultimate crescendo. And when you look at so many things that have changed in our world, including what we referenced earlier with technology, but also many of the challenges we're facing that are, civilization challenging. I sort of, in a kind of ironic humor, have said recently that I almost imagine printing these t-shirts that say extinction level, baby, because we have 3 or 4 extinction level kinds of matters arising in our time, and that's never happened in the history of humanity. At the same time, there does seem to be a ramping up of these connections and this kind of communication, not just a ramping up in terms of more encounters that our naval groups and our military groups are having with some sort of apparently non-human intelligence, but also that individuals all around the world are having more contact experiences, and that even that this veil seems to be thinning, that this sort of boundary between this world and other kinds of expressions of reality seems to be thinning, so more is bleeding through, even to the point where for young people, this often will end up manifesting as anxiety, because referring to the kind of hollow movement again, it's as if there's extra energy, extra interference patterns in the mix. And if you think about our brain as being kind of this quantum transducer for non-local consciousness, it ends up being manifested as anxiety because sometimes our brains don't know what to do with this extra energy, but it seems to be all connected. And I even think about what Terence McKenna said in the 90s. He talked about, in the end, it's moving towards what he called the transcendental object at the end of time. And that as we approach that point, things would get weirder and weirder and weirder. And we would eventually have to start talking about the weirdness. And that's exactly what you and I are doing today, is we're talking about our own experience of weirdness, encountering so many others who also are encountering that weirdness, and noticing that weirdness is even spilling over into kind of a macro level in our society. So absolutely, to me, it does seem to be leading to something. And because some of these intelligences have such a larger scope of seeing into the future and whatnot, my sense is they see what's ahead of us, and that their ramping up is tied to that at the same time as the challenges we are facing also relate to that moment in time in the future. So in that sense, it's a remarkable time to be alive, sometimes overwhelming, but also extraordinary. And that's kind of the way that I look at it.
Yeah. I need to thank you so much for talking with me on this podcast here. You are such a beautiful, clear thinker and clear speaker. And this realm, this field, especially this field that can be kind of closed off, like it feels like a little private club sometimes. And your voice, more than almost anyone that I've talked with, it feels like you can bridge that and you can address the most esoteric and complex subjects in a very grounded, calm, thoughtful way. And I feel like that is required right now in this present time of ramping up. I feel that it's ramping up. I say this all the time, this kind of thing. I feel this. It's my sense. I have to trust that. And then all I can do is proceed forward doing the best work I can do. Right? There's things I want out of this. I don't often get the things I want. I feel like I get the things I need, or the correct things, let me put it that way, for me in the moment.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Mike. And I've really appreciated this conversation because this is one of those rare interviews where we do a really deep dive and cover the depth and breadth of what's associated with this entire sort of combination of topics. And it's been really fulfilling for me. And speaking to what you talked about in terms of my role in this moment, it's an incredibly rewarding, fulfilling experience to have this calling, this kind of vocation is the way I look at it, where the very expression that you feel called to sort of fulfill in the world is the very kind of movement that needs to happen in the world. So it's very much this delivery mechanism that already has a place to receive it. And this is part of that, again, synchronistically orchestrated, interconnected biome that we're a part of. And that has been the biggest shift in my perspective of my life and what it means. And it's become so, so powerful for me. And I hope others find some of the same thing, that this movement will move us more towards a shamanized society, that this re-enchantment is something that everyone can kind of touch.
This is the very first podcast I have recorded after a 10-year, well, more than 10 years, hiatus on my Hidden Experience podcast. And as I re-entered this field of podcasting, I did not want to, in any way, shape, or form, stay above the waterline. I wanted to take the deep dive into potentially the most challenging subjects and put it out there. I think people are starving for this. I don't want to simplify the subject. I want to address through conversation the most challenging aspects and the most mysterious and as you just said, the most rewarding aspects of this collective strangeness that seems to be swirling around all of us all the time if we only look at it.
Yeah, that resonates so much. And I think about my conversation with Bernardo Kastrup, where he talked about our society's obsession with closure, with feeling like we finally figured it all out. And my perspective for a while now, and this definitely fits in with a sort of shamanic kind of perspective, is that this is an adventure to be explored, not a problem to solve. So I think both you and I are kind of engaging with these matters in that kind of way. And again, it's about trying to expand what we are, not try to close it down into a simple answer.
How do people get a hold of you, and how do people find you online?
Well, I have two podcasts. I have Point of Convergence, which is its own podcast you can find on all the usual podcast platforms. I have a second podcast called Liminal Frames, frames spelled PH, in nod to phenomenon there. So those are two individual podcasts that are on their own individual platforms. And then I also have a YouTube channel, which is /ExoAcademian, and that has both of those podcasts in video format with basically a static image, listening to the audio. And then I also have my Essence of Being platform. You can go to that website at essenceofbeing.info, where people can learn about the courses I teach, the retreats I host. And you can also check out the John Mack Institute, which will have a new website soon, and the work I do there as well. So pretty much between those places, they can find what I'm working on.
Wow, you're busy.
I am, but I love it. It's so fulfilling, and they each kind of play into each other. So to me, it kind of feels like a seamless existence. But it's 100% of my time and energy goes into it. But that's completely fine with me because it's what gives me the most energy.
This has been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mike. I've appreciated it as well.
This is Mike, and I am chiming in after the editing. A few things. That little musical note that is used to buffer between different segments of the conversation and the interview and my spoken words here at the end, that's just a little clip of music that I'm using as a segue between different elements. I will be finding something better here soon, but for now, that's all I need. Let me say this also. Patreon listeners, there is about 20 minutes or more of this same conversation for members on this site. And please check the show notes for some relevant links to Darren's podcasts and for his website. And one final note. During the interview, Darren spoke about free will, and this reminded me of a quote from Carl Jung, and I'll read it here now. Free will is the ability to do gladly that which one must do. Given the context of the conversation I had with Darren, this quote seems so plain and clear. Darren and I both addressed our roles in this mystery and how these somehow feel orchestrated by an outside intelligence. We are both on some similar path, and I think we both realize we had to come to terms with this in our lives. I feel like I know a lot of people who have had to confront this same thing, and a lot of them are doing their own podcasts. Let me read that line one more time. free will is the ability to do gladly that which one must do. If you've made it this far, thank you so much. Bye now. What you just listened to was the YouTube version of the Hidden Experience audio podcast. This show is hosted by Mike Cleland, and that's me, and it is available on most of the popular podcast platforms. Just search out Hidden Experience Audio. And if you want to support the show, you can find it on Patreon, as well as Buy Me a Coffee. This YouTube version has ads, but the audio version is always ad-free. And you can also join my YouTube channel here. Thank you so much for listening, and please support this show.